Hello everyone, this is Bentley from Kent, Washington, and today in our Plants for Profit series, we're going to talk about CO2. You guys requested this on the poll overwhelmingly compared to some of the other options for videos, so this is what you're getting right away. So let's go through the basics of CO2. I'm not going to go really hyper in-depth. I'm going to try not to be too scientific. If you really want something that deep down, I highly suggest just doing your own kind of research via Google. You can find lots and lots of stuff out there. Planet Take Forum, Tom Barr on the Barr Report, things like that. You're going to find much more in depth. But let's go over why, if you really want to do plans for profit very seriously, CO2 is a necessity. So, first off, why? CO2 is going to provide carbon. Now, you could say, well, why don't I just use Flourish Excel or Aquarium Co-op Easy Carbon or any of the liquid carbon based products out there? There are a lot of plants that do not take that liquid carbon out or struggle and suffer because of liquid carbon. And a great example would be Madagascar lace. If you pour any kind of liquid carbon in with a Madagascar lace, you're just going to melt it to death. There's just something in those liquid carbon products, and part of it has to do with the glutaraldehyde that is typically included in them, that does not absorb as well as actual gas CO2 being injected into the aquarium. So that being said, there's kind of two methodologies. There's pressurized CO2, where you're getting a regulator, you're getting a tank, you're using a diffuser, or there's DIY CO2, where you're using typically a yeast concoction that is off-gassing amounts, just some amount of CO2, and then you're running it into a diffuser. Let me dispel something right away. Don't use DIY CO2. Just don't do it. Not for plants for profit. Now, if you're going to do it for a small tank, and you don't need very much CO2, you don't need very consistent CO2, a DIY CO2 is an option. I don't think it's worth the hassle, honestly. Yes, pressurized CO2 is a bit of an investment to start. However, once you start, it is well worth it, and the upkeep cost over time is extremely cheap. So just don't do DIY CO2. I guess this is my lesson. Don't do DIY CO2. As far as pressurized CO2 is concerned, this is where there's a lot of room. There's all sorts of different tank sizes, different types of regulators, and we're going to go over a lot of that. So why, what that extra carbon, why does that matter so much? Carbon's the building block of life. That's how plants grow. Brondo is not what plants crave. I hate to break it to you guys, for those of you who are Idiocracy fans. It's not about the electrolytes. You need that carbon, but more importantly, when they have more carbon, those plants are going to uptake more nutrients. So with even just a little CO2, you're going to have better color, better growth, better leaf density, all of that. They'll be able to photosynthesize more efficiently and more. And it's just all those things that plants need in order to do better. CO2 is going to provide that. Now, there's kind of two schools of thought about how much CO2 is in your tank. You've got that very much, I'm going to put a drop checker in my tank. I'm going to make sure it stays green, or I'm going to get myself between 30 and 35 parts per million if you're going to do the math way, which is comparing your carbonate hardness, or KH, to your pH. And there's a table that will tell you what your basically parts per million of CO2 in the water is when you do that. I don't prescribe to doing it that crazy. Honestly, you can do the ADA style where it's very high CO2. Sometimes you're doing even more CO2 than the drop checker would say is safe. I also don't think that is that wise. But that's a personal choice. I don't want to have to maintain my plants every week. I don't want to have to put hours and hours into a tank every week. Now, if you've only got one tank and you just want it to look stunning, this beautiful, well-planted aquascape where you want the plants to always look vibrant and great, yeah, you can have much higher CO2. Just, of course, don't put so much CO2 in there you're going to kill your fish. That's where drop checkers matter. Keeping in that green where you're at 30 to 35 parts per million is great. That's usually a safe level for most of your tetras and all your nanofish who are used to those kind of fast-flowing environments where you just have to inject extra oxygen to make sure that they've got enough oxygen to deal with that CO2, and then they're fine. I personally prescribe to a method of low and slow, kind of like barbecue. I think that 20 to 25 parts per million is the right range to sit. So on something like a 40-gallon breeder, I'm only doing 2 bubbles per second on my drop, my bubble counter. So for those of you who have done CO2 before, you're going to be like, that's not a lot of CO2. Like, exactly. I don't want too much CO2. I want just enough to increase the growth rate, to keep those more high demand plants happy, and to get that more vibrant color. I don't want so much that I'm going to have to be in that tank every week. You guys know my work schedule. There's no way that I can personally do that. And from my experience, I have tried higher levels before my work schedule became what it was. I actually don't like pushing CO2 that hard because, one, I run out of CO2 faster, so it becomes more expensive. And two, the trade-off in growth rate is just not worth it. I'd rather wait that extra week or that extra 2 weeks to get a lush, healthy, beautiful, vibrant plant on significantly less CO2 and less fertilizer, because if you push that CO2 really high and you get that really high growth rate, you might not be putting enough fertilizer into it to ensure that that plant stays robust and healthy. You might get these kind of thin, just not as dense leaved, or you might start running into issues where you'll see holes in the leaves, discoloration, because it's not getting enough nutrients to deal with how much it can grow based on your light and if you have that high CO2 rate. So there's some basics. Let's dive in. I've prepared a little video for you guys to just kind of go over kind of the stages of regulators that you can look at in pressurized CO2, and then also talk about the appropriate tanks that go with those. So let's go ahead and dive into that video, and then we'll come back and we'll start talking about diffusers. Okay, so we're going to do a quick dive into diffusers and tanks and the most important things to look for and kind of the steps as far as like starter, mid-grade, and kind of a high-grade diffuser. Or, I'm sorry, regulator, not diffusers. We'll do diffusers in a second. So the start is going to be using something like this, which is a paintball-based tank, instead of this larger tank. Okay? These paintball rigs are really simple. They just take a standard paintball thing that you can get at any sporting goods store. Dick's is a great example. Most of them will fill those tanks in store as well. And then you're looking at something like this. This is a little Aquatech regulator. Very simple. The most important part is that it has a solenoid. No matter what kind of regulator you get, always make sure you have a solenoid. What this does is when it doesn't have power supplied to the regulator, it does not allow gas to run through. So this allows you to turn the regulator's power off to make sure that you're not running gas into your tank. So you can put it on a timer, just like your lights. It goes off, easy peasy. The important parts. You have a needle valve control here. This controls the rate of gas going from your regulator out to your tank. You can see here I've just got a clear line on it. Very standard. This is a standard airline, but normally I would use a different tubing personally, and I'll talk about that in a sec. That's going to go to a bubble counter. Here's a really common one. You can have fancier ones than this. There's tons of different types of bubble counters. This is a really simple one. You fill it with fluid. You can literally watch the bubbles go through, and then they're going to go up the next line into whatever diffuser you're using that goes into your tank. You have 2 gauges here. This is the gauge that tells you the PSI, so the pressure of the air coming through the regulator. And then this one tells you how much pressure is left in your tank. So if it's in green, you're good. White, you're okay. Once you start getting to the red, you're starting to run out, and it's probably going to run out pretty fast in the small models like this, designed to run with paintball tanks, just because when it gets to that lower pressure, it really doesn't properly read those levels well, and they run out pretty fast when they get there. Pretty simple. Your next major step up is going to go away from a paintball tank like this. And the other thing is, again, this here is where you connect to the paintball tank. It's literally just going to sit right on top. Right on here, you're going to screw right in. There's a little kind of a pressure needle there, and you're going to hear kind of a ting noise when you know it's connected. At least for my tipman and this particular thing, that's what happens. Your next major step up is going to be going to a standard tank like this. This is a 5-pound tank. You can get 10, 20 pounds. You can get up to 50 pounds. Really, you never need to go more than, like, I would say 20 is probably the most you need. Your next major step up is going to be something like this CO2 Art Regulator. You notice this one already has a bubble counter installed in it. This is a kind of a fancier bubble counter. It looks neat. It does the exact same thing that this little plastic guy that suctions onto the side of your tank does. This just looks a little cleaner. It's right there at the regulator, so you can adjust the needle valve here and watch the flow rate right here to get everything dialed in for your tank. Much like that paintball tank, you cannot adjust the PSI. You actually see this one is do not adjust this bolt. So you're just going to read the PSI coming in, and you can adjust that at your tank level. It's a little tricky, but it's possible. And then this is going to tell you how much is remaining. Very simple. The only difference is you got a much bigger thread here, a little bit higher quality. Not to say that the Aquatech's not bad, but just the ones that are designed for paintball canisters. The way the paintball canister is designed, once it gets low on gas, it kind of can gas off a little. They're fine if you're not doing a lot of fish, or you're in a fish that is used to, say, lower pH. I wouldn't worry about it. And the likeliness of you like hurting your fish when you get low on gas is really low if your flow rate's pretty low. So I wouldn't worry about that. Just the difference is slightly more durable construction here, designed for a more stable tank. That's it. Then your next major step up is going to be something like this other Aquatech I have. That, again, you've got your solenoid, your gauges, needle valve. This one doesn't have a built-in bubble counter, but you would just run it to another bubble counter just like you do on that other one. The big thing here is this gauge allows you to adjust the PSI coming into the regulator from your tank so that you can dial it into exactly the pressure you want. Where this matters is that for some of the special CO2-proof tubing that's designed to run in these higher tech setups like this, running off of these tanks, they typically want between 30 and 35 PSI as far as their pressure that they want in the line in order to make the line operate correctly. Sometimes this is more reliant on the diffuser you use, and I'll get into that in just a moment when we talk about diffusers. So let's break this down. What really matters? The most important things, I'm going to use this CO2 Art one just because it's kind of compact. You must have a solenoid. You're going to need a bubble counter, whether it's pre-built in or it's an attached one like that. You'll want to dial it in so that you're only getting so much going through, because you don't want to just like pour tons of CO2 into a tank. You'll kill your fish. And then the correct tank. For the most part, I would generally suggest, unless you're doing a small nano tank, only one small nano tank, and you want minimal space, because this just does not take up very much room. It's a paintball tank. It's tiny. The regulator's tiny. Takes up no space. Go with something like this. This 5-pound cylinder is going to last you a long while. The big thing is with these, let me see, is that in frame? Okay, good. You're going to need a washer like this that goes between your regulator and your cylinder. It's just going to, dial in here. I personally prefer, like you'll notice, it's kind of hard to see, but inside this one you can kind of see there's a kind of whitish silicone one already built into this regulator. I prefer those, the softer silicone ones, than like a hard ceramic like this. But you can use these. They're typically provided by like a welding supply or brewing supply place. That's going to go here. It just helps create a seal to make sure you don't lose any of your gas. Again, I prefer the soft silicone ones. Generally, I think they're a little better forming that seal. Where do you need this? Where do you need this nicer regulator? And there's other ones like your Greenleaf aquariums, your ADA, your bigger guys like that. Where do you need to be able to adjust this? That really comes down to if you're using something like a CO2 reactor or an atomic diffuser. And we're going to talk about those very shortly. But those are they're going to get you better CO2 diffusion into your water. And they require certain levels of PSI. And because you can't dial something like this CO2 Art in, you need something like this to do it right. Will it still work? Yes. Is it going to be optimal? No. Where these are great is if you're using like the little disc diffusers or some of the glass diffusers that have the ceramic disc on top. These are perfect. The difference in price is quite a bit. This is like $120 if I remember right. This is like $225. So, for the extra $100 you can adjust your PSI. Is that worth it? It depends on your equipment and what you're trying to do. I personally think that this is probably like the best start middle of the road is something like this. You can get something like this, not necessarily specifically the CO2 Art. You can get some cheaper models. They're typically Chinese made, but they're still pretty good. I know lots of people that use them for like $60 on Amazon. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but if you want to do one thing really well, buying a good regulator is like buying good light. A good regulator is going to be much more worthwhile for you in the long run than getting something cheap and realizing you want to replace it because you need something better down the road. So let's go ahead and jump back to my smiling face and away from this video, and we'll start talking about diffusers. All right, so that gives you the basics of your regulators and kind of the stages of regulators. Now, you can go even way higher depth where it comes to some of the real hardcore regulators. You know, your CO2 arts, like their Elite line, I believe it's called, the upgraded line. When you get to start getting into something like the Greenleaf Aquariums regulators, where they start doing things where you have multiple manifolds or all sorts of extra bells and whistles. We don't need to worry about that. There's the basics that we need to look at are what's important. And we've covered that so far. So the next major thing, you've got let's say you've selected your regulator, you've got your tank that goes with that regulator, you got your line, you're going to go into a diffuser. Two things before we get to that diffuser. Number one, if you have a bigger regulator, you're not using like a paintball style CO2 regulator and a paintball tank, I would use CO2 proof tubing. There's either the Aquatech or like Greenleaf Aquariums make some. There's a lot of different companies that make it. I think Nylock G has a line of it too. It's just a better tubing when it comes to CO2. It does typically want slightly more pressure, but almost everything is going to be at least 30 psi. And it's better with some of the nicer diffusers that we're going to talk about here in a second, like your atomic diffusers or your inline reactors. And more importantly, it lasts a lot longer. Over time, your standard airline hose, when CO2 is being pushed through it, is going to degrade and eventually leak. So you're going to lose that CO2 that you're pumping in there. That precious, precious CO2 you're going to lose. For the difference in cost, and yeah, it's a little more expensive, but you only have to buy the tubing really once. It's just worth buying a CO2-proof tubing. I actually buy mine in a completely different color. The big thing is it's a lot stiffer. Like when you feel it, you know, your airline tube you can just bend and do all sorts of stuff with. Typically, especially like the was it Aqueon that has the blue stuff that's like really, really bendable and really nice. Your CO2-proof tubing is not like that. It's a lot more rigid. Like it's still going to bend a little bit and flex some. You could coil it, but where you could do a very tight circle with your normal airline, you're going to have a much bigger coil, something like this, with your CO2-proof tubing because of how stiff it is naturally. It just can't bend that much. But that's good. You're going to hold all your CO2 in. It does kind of form a little bit better seal just because it's a little tight. It's going to get onto that fitting real good. And with your better diffusers, honestly, it's pretty much a necessity. Is it truly required? No. But that's my suggestion. So we've got our tubing, we've got our regulator, we've got our bubble counter, we've got our tank, we're ready to go. What kind of diffuser should I use? What are the different types of diffusers? And where does it matter which one I use? Let's go into that. I've actually prepared several images for you, and most of these are just grabbed off the web. A lot of them are from the manufacturers of these different ones. So let's start. This here is an atomic diffuser. These have a basically ceramic bar, and then they typically have a check valve. You have this, which is like your atypical little common disc ceramic. This is a Fluval. You can find these almost everywhere. They're cheap, but they clog up and can die easily. This is an inline atomic reactor, so it's kind of the difference between a true reactor and an atomic diffuser. These are designed to have CO2, have input from your filter, and then your output. Similarly, this is a CO2 ladder. These are not as common anymore. Just technology's gotten better on the other things. And then you have stuff like this. It's a neo diffuser. These are significantly better when it comes to look and appearance. There's all sorts of different versions. And then you go real hardcore and you get into the true reactors like this. This is a Rex Griggs reactor. There's Surges reactors. There's all sorts of stuff. So let's kind of start breaking these down. I'll just keep letting the slides roll through, but I'll start explaining each of them on their own. This, like, we'll start with the disc reactors like this flue vol, and in a sense, the Neo CO2 reactors, like all the ones that have the glass and they have the ceramic ring on top or down in, they all run on the same theory. The difference is the ones with the glass are a little bit nicer, or there's stainless steel ones you can get. Basically, you just have a ceramic disc that has very, very fine micropores in it. Your CO2 is going to come up into the disc and then slowly disperse into small micro bubbles into the rest of your tank. Now, the nice thing about these is that they, especially the nice, like this one here, these nice glass Neo ones, they're simple, they're small, they can go in anything. They're great for nano tanks. So if you're doing anything that's like, say, 29 gallons or smaller, and I know 29 gallons isn't a nano tank. To me, it is. I'm a guy who's like, 75 gallons or bigger, that's a good tank. Any of those nano tanks, these are going to be some of your best bets just because they're small, they're low profile, they don't require the pressure that, so they don't require that like 30 to 35 psi that an atomic reactor or any of the like inline reactors like the Surges, the Rex Griggs, the inline diffuser, like this media reactor right here. They don't require that much pressure, so they can run on even as small as a paintball tank. Anything where you can't control the pressure, they're perfectly fine on. The downside, the cheap ones like the flue vols, and not to just bash on flue vols, just happen to be the one that I have. Those, like, they're just a plastic casing and a small ceramic disc. They're going to clog up a lot faster. You're going to have to clean them regularly. The big thing about cleaning any of the ceramics, whether it's atomic diffuser, any of the ring types, you don't just rub them. Because you're going to push everything down into the ceramic, clog the pores, and you'll never get it working again. What you do is you take them out, you will put them in a bleach solution. It's typically something like 1 cup bleach for every 1 gallon of water, and you just let them sit for a while. I personally actually use 1 part bleach to every 3 parts water. So if I'm doing a cup of bleach, it's 3 cups of water instead of a gallon. I want a really strong mixture. I'm going to let it soak for 20 minutes or so. That bleach is going to eat away at any algae and debris and stuff that's got in there. But take it out. I'm going to rinse it real good. I'm just going to run another tap water for a while. And then I'm going to create a small container with a little bit of water and a whole lot of dechlorinator. And I'm going to let it sit and soak in all that dechlorinator for like half an hour. And then I'm going to rinse it again. And I'm going to go back into another batch of dechlorinator. I'm going to really make sure I've gotten all of that chlorine from the bleach out, just to be safe. Then it goes back in the tank, it's fine. I've found with my particular ones that I use, I tend to like either the inlines or the atomic diffusers. The atomic diffusers I have to clean about every 2 months. The inlines, most of them you don't have to ever clean. You just don't. It's the nice part about them. Some you do, and I'll explain that in a sec. Okay, so why do I use an inline reactor? Or why do I use an atomic diffuser? We'll start with the atomic diffuser. So that's going to be the one where it's a long kind of bar of ceramic, and it's got its caps on the end. Most commonly, you can get them with a built-in check valve. This is kind of like the best version of the ceramic ring diffuser. They're much more fine as far as the mist they put off. Because they're a longer bar, it allows your CO2 to travel a little farther and be perforating more and more through that. It puts off a finer mist. It allows for more CO2 without pushing as much raw gas out. So what I mean there is, because these typically, here's what I'm talking about here, the atomic diffuser, because they require at least 30 psi, typically they want 35 psi, that gas is pushing a lot harder. And those pores in that ceramic are far smaller than the standard ring diffusers. So that mist of bubbles that's going to come out of there is really, really small. And that helps really diffuse into the water much better. I tend to put mine, so if I've got my atomic diffuser here, my outflow of water is right here. So it's barely going up, and the water flow is going to hit it and push it around the tank. And that helps kind of maximize the amount of CO2 I get in the water without having to push more and more raw gas into the tank. This is why I believe in the low and slow method. I can use a lot less CO2 over time and still get a very, very effective amount of boost to my plants. So the big thing with these is they are more expensive. Your ring diffusers, you can typically get those from anywhere from $10 for really cheap ones to about $20 for a good one. An atomic diffuser like this is going to cost you anywhere between $35 and I think $50, depending on where you buy it. Whether you buy it from like Greenleaf aquariums, where they're a little more expensive, or you buy one of the other slightly less expensive brands, they all do the same thing. The difference is so minimal. And there are ones without check valves built in. I don't typically like those. I like the ones with the built-in check valve just to be safe. It's better safe than sorry. Yeah, those tend to be my preference. They're like the best version of the ring adapter. For anything that's like 40 to say 75 or 90 gallons, I really like those. Once you start getting over 100 gallons of water, I really think you need to start looking into something like an inline reactor. But we'll talk about those in a sec. The other one that I've showed, and it's weird and interesting, is a CO2 ladder. So we'll have the image coming up in a second. The way that this works is it has this crisscross that goes in this big kind of box housing. And the CO2 bubbles slowly travel up the ladder and slowly get smaller and smaller as they diffuse more and more into the water. And the water is in there the whole time. These are going to sit inside your tank. There are some that work like inline reactors where you're pushing water through them. I've seen them, but they're not that great. Here's an example right here of the CO2 ladder. You can see the bubbles getting smaller and smaller as they go toward the top, and they finally get released into the water. I don't like them because they take up a lot of room. They can get dirty, not very dirty, but like the outside can get algae and stuff. Not the inside can get kind of messed up. It's just not. It takes up room I don't think is necessary. I would much rather, for the cost, most of them are pretty cheap, but I would rather, if I'm going to spend that extra money and get like an inline reactor or an atomic diffuser or one of the very nice ring diffusers like the glass neo diffusers or some of the stainless steel ones that are out there. Some of those are really, really nice, do great jobs. I just think that those neo diffusers aren't very good once you get over about 30-gallon tanks. Maybe 40 is kind of pushing the edge. You start getting to something like a 75 or something like that. It's almost too big for some of those. You kind of need that extra size that you can get in either an atomic diffuser or by simply using the inline reactor. Finally, there's like 7. There's a bunch of different types of inline reactors. The 3 kind of major ones are going to be an atomic reactor, a Rex Griggs, which is this right here, and then a Surgis reactor. Surgis is really similar. You're taking basically the housing for a water filter, like an in-house water filter, and you're turning that into a CO2 reactor. It's really similar to the way that Rex Griggs reactor looks. The atomic are basically the ceramic pylon that comes from an atomic diffuser inside a housing. And so how these are all going to work is they're going to have an input of water flow, like you can see here. On the side, you've got the CO2 input, and then the output of water flow going at the bottom. Water pushes in, CO2 pushes in, they mix up, and then they go out, and it just kind of maximizes your how much the CO2 dissolves into the water. With some of the really nice reactors, like a Surgis or a Rex Griggs, they're a lot bigger. You know, you get these like PVC pipes, basically, that are this big. You're going to get 100% dissolution. You're not going to lose any gas whatsoever by moving in and out of the water. It's going to be all dissolved into the water. The atomic reactors, they're a lot smaller. You know, they're only a yay big, much like an atomic diffuser. But do you dissolve 100%? No. Do you dissolve 98%? Yeah. The difference is really minimal. It really just depends on how big your water system is and how much CO2 you need to push. For something like the small atomic diffusers, they're great up to, say, 150 gallons. And, you know, you'll attach them. Most of them can only attach to some of the smaller filters. They don't really attach to sumps very well. So if you're doing a sump system, you really want to look at like a Rex Griggs or a Surgis or DIY versions of some of those. Actually, below, I will link to Corvus Oskin. Joel has a great DIY CO2 reactor build where he walks you step by step on how to build one out of easy to acquire PVC parts for your CO2 reactor, and then just a few bio balls, and that's it. It's super simple. Even someone who is not handy like me could probably put that together. But those, I think, once you start getting the big water systems or sumped water systems, you need to start looking toward those. Anything like if you want to do a massive planted tank, you want to do like 180, 200 gallons, something like that, you really should just look at a reactor, because that's going to hook directly to your filter, whether that's you've got a big canister, and it does need to be something that has a line. So typically canister filters or sumps, or a sump if you're doing one of the bigger reactors. And it's just going to dissolve all that CO2 into the water. All the water that you're pushing in that tank is going to have CO2 dissolved into it. It's going to help all your plants. They're the most efficient types of CO2 diffuser. They are also the most expensive. That being said, the difference can be very minimal. Instead of paying $30 for a really nice Neo diffuser, you might pay $50 to $75 for a really nice CO2 reactor. And while, yeah, you're like, well, that's almost triple the cost or double the cost. If you think about it for the long term, that little CO2 Neo diffuser, it's going to last you a little bit. But eventually, after a few years, you are probably going to have to replace it because the ceramic will get clogged in a way you can't clean. Those big reactors that are using like plastic biomedia, you never have to replace them. They clean themselves. They last forever. I mean, I guess technically they probably have a shelf life. It's probably like 10 years. But for the difference in price to get easily double the amount of life, it is worth it. So that being said, all right, you've talked about CO2. You've told us the difference in diffusers. You've told us the difference in regulators. You gave us some basics on tanks. What do you use? Well, let me show you what I use specifically for the Plants for Profit tank. And more importantly, I actually use one regulator made by GLA, that's Greenleaf Aquariums, and it feeds 3 different tanks. So it feeds the Leopoldi Angel tank, it feeds the Guppy Mansion, and it feeds the Plants for Profit. Plants for Profit, that's really great, huh? It feeds the Plants for Profit tank that has all the Co2 Tetras. So let's go over to a short video of that, and I will show you just a quick shot of what that looks like, and then we'll come back and I'll talk about why I use that and where it's relevant to have a system like that. So here's my personal regulator and setup. I'm on a 20-pound CO2 tank using a GLA, I believe this is a Pro. And you see I have 3 manifolds, each one goes to a different tank, and the tubes are labeled. You can see the CO2-proof tubing I use. That bolt controls the PSI there, and then you can see those white knobs down below. Those adjust the bubbles per second. You'll notice I don't even have any liquid in my bubble counters right now. It's just slowly evaporated over time because I have it so dialed in, I don't have to worry about it. I will eventually refill them, but it doesn't matter that much. I've just got it dialed in. I know what it looks like to know how much CO2 is pushing into my tanks. Pretty simple. So there you go. You can see my setup is both complex and simple all at the same time. It's nothing too crazy. It is a single regulator on a single tank. That 20-pound CO2 tank, because I go by a low and slow method, has lasted me 9 months? 6 months? It's at 6 months right now, and it's still probably got 3 or 4 months left. And it's feeding 240 breeders and the 140 acrylic. So it's providing CO2 to almost, I would say, 250 gallons of water if you account for some of the water that's sitting inside of the filters for the 140. So that's pretty good. You can see the advantage of using pressurized CO2 with a lower CO2 volume, not pushing that much higher CO2 where you're really pushing a lot. Now, if you want to see pretty purling, like all the ADA videos, yeah, you need to push your CO2 a lot harder because you need to produce so much excess gas that they bubble up inside the water. I don't care about purling. I can make purling happen with a water change. That's how most of that is actually shown on videos, is that they water change beforehand and show you shots of pretty purling that's not actual purling, but some, of course, happens. Some of my plants purl. That's not that important. If you really want that aesthetic, you can figure out ways to do it. What is important in this basics video is understanding why CO2 matters, what you need to make CO2 work, and then more importantly, what products fit your needs. So we've got, your 3 stages of regulators. You've got all sorts of different diffusers. It's all about selecting what fits your budget and what your tank needs or requires. Are you doing a tank full of nothing but hard, difficult plants, and you need really high CO2? Then you probably want an inline reactor going to a canister filter or a sump, and then you want to have a pressure, really nice regulator that's going to let you really push that CO2 hard to get lots of CO2 into your water, and you're going to need to oxygenate the heck out of your tank to make sure you don't kill your fish. Are you trying to grow lots of easy plants but faster because the people that you're trying to sell to are, oh, I got a low light system, or I have a simple tank, I've never done plants before, whatever your reason is. Most of the people that you want to give, like Pogostemon octopus, Java fern, water sprite, all those really easy practically bulletproof plants. I won't say actually bulletproof, but practically bulletproof. You don't need a lot of CO2 for those. Just a little CO2 makes those things grow like weeds. So it's all about selecting exactly what you need. Now, my personal suggestion, I think those CO2 Art Regulators are great. I think there's also good options at like $60 on Amazon that aren't quite as fancy, but will do the trick as your first intro regulator. As you get further along, maybe you want to do multiple tanks, you want to have CO2 in everything. Well, there's no reason to get a regulator on every tank, and a tank, a CO2 tank per tank. Get one bigger CO2 tank, a regulator that has multiple manifolds, so you can run lines to multiple tanks. There's also some brass units where on the one manifold you can attach and it will split for you. Aquatech makes one of those. It's a really great product. There's ways to make it so you only need one big tank and one regulator. Save money where you can, guys. But this, if you really want to pursue plants for profit seriously, you need CO2. It's just the way it is. In order to grow plants fast enough, on demand, and to also grow the variants of plants you need, whether that's the difficult plants for some of your more collector type people, or maybe you just want some nicer plants for those people that want to, you've got them used to all the easy plants, now they want to, that next step, they want to move up. I want to try some cool rotalas, or I want lots of red plants. Well, that's where you're going to need CO2, because almost all those red plants require CO2, or at least to get that beautiful, rich orange and red hues, you're going to need the CO2 to really get that nutrient uptake and that growth that helps them display that maximum color. That's it, guys. That is your basics on CO2. If you have any questions, please put them down in the comments below. I love answering questions to help you guys out. Maybe there's something else you think that I need to cover in maybe a more in-depth guide later on in the future. Put those down in the comments. Let me know. I'm happy to respond and kind of have a conversation with you guys. That's part of the fun about doing YouTube for me. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.